for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing a Godzilla movie that seamlessly goes by a ton of movie titles. One of them being The Invasion of Astro-Monster, as it was released in Japan, and that's what many Godzilla fans call this particular movie, while other parts of the world called the movie Great Monster War, while in the United States of America, it was released simply as Monster Zero. But when the movie was released on home video, it was called Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, and for the remainder of the review, I'll just call it Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, since that's how I was introduced to the movie. But anywho, with Ghidorah the three-headed monster being a smash hit in both Japan and America, Toho decided to expand the tone and concepts that were introduced in Ghidorah the three-headed monster for this movie. Since around this time period, space travel has become a very popular concept, as seen in my previous review of Warning from Space. Also, the American cut of the movie was a co-production between Toho and American co-producer Henry G. Saperstein, if I'm pronouncing that name right at all, who had taken over the animation studio UPA, which was known for releasing theatrical cartoons during the 1950s, and since then have been on the decline. And if you're wondering why UPA sounds so familiar, it was the animation studio that was responsible for making the Mr. Magoo cartoon. But anyway, Henry Saperstein decided he wanted to move past making animated TV shows and wanted to bring some Japanese monster movies over in America around that time period, and managed to get the rights to The Invasion of Astro-Monster and sold the rights to AIP, and sometime later AIP did a double bill with the other Toho movie War of the Gargantuas. The movie is also known for having the American actor Nick Adams, who had previously appeared in the other Toho American movie Frankenstein Conquers the World. But anywho, is Godzilla vs. Monster Zero a good movie? As for the plot of this movie, a new planet is discovered and astronauts Glenn and Fuji are sent up to the newly discovered planet, dubbed Planet X, to investigate. But while the astronauts are investigating the planet, a mysterious alien race calls out to them, warning them that a monster they dubbed Monster Zero is approaching, only to discover that Monster Zero in question is really the intergalactic planet-destroying dragon King Ghidorah. Soon, an alliance is made between the human race and the alien race known as the Xiliens, in hopes that the two groups can neutralize King Ghidorah together by successfully mind-controlling two of Earth's mightiest monsters, Godzilla and Rodan. But as Godzilla and Rodan battle King Ghidorah, astronaut Glenn slowly uncovers a conspiracy theory surrounding the Xiliens. Can he figure out what the conspiracy theory is before it's too late? Alright, so normally when I have been reviewing the movies up to this point, usually I talk about what I liked and disliked about the Japanese version first, then talk about what I liked and disliked about the American cut. But both cuts of this movie are so similar that I'm just going to clump them in all together and just talk about it as if it's one movie. It maybe gives some slight detail in terms of what worked and didn't work about the American cut, but again, I'm not going to go into too much detail since the two cuts of the movie are pretty similar. But anywho, in terms of what I liked about the movie, remember in my review of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster how I liked the fact that the movie introduced concepts in relation to space, from the princess who was possessed by this alien consciousness to King Ghidorah being a monster that came from outer space? In this movie, they go further with those aspects, since we do get introduced to an alien species known as the Xiliens. Because with Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, sure, we did get introduced to someone who claimed to have been an alien, but it was just a regular human woman that just happened to be possessed by an alien consciousness. This here, we get introduced to physical, living, breathing extraterrestrials in the form of the Xiliens. Granted, I do have a problem with them in regards if they're alien or not, but I'll tackle that later. I also like the fact that this is the first movie within the Godzilla franchise to really push for the concepts of space travel, since all the movies before this primarily took place on Earth, so I found it refreshing that we visited a location that wasn't Earth, but another planet altogether, which made a lot of sense considering the fact that during this time period, a lot of TV shows ranging from Lost in Space to The Jetsons, along with several movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, along with Barbarella, were starting to explore the concepts of space travel, since the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States was essentially a big event going on around this time period. So it only made sense for Toho to also cash in on this idea as well, since they also made their own space-themed movies, from Battle in Outer Space to War in Space. I also like how the movie takes several concepts and ideas from other Japanese science fiction movies of the time, from Warning from Space, along with Battle in Outer Space, and mixed them together to form the central story to this movie. And what do I mean by this? In my review of Warning from Space, the primary mission of the aliens in that movie were to warn mankind of the oncoming threat that was a rogue planet about to come into contact with Earth, causing various disasters. With something like the Battle in Outer Space, an alien race comes to Earth and hopes to invade it and attack several cities in the process, which forces all of Earth to fight back against the alien invaders. With this movie, on the other hand, at first it looks like the plot is going to be about mankind teaming up with a friendly group of aliens to combat a threat that they have in common, that being King Ghidorah. But as the movie progresses, the tables switch and becomes a alien invasion story with giant monsters, which is a really unique idea for a movie. Because when you look at any alien invasion movie, it's just the aliens and their spaceships destroying various cities around the Earth. This year, they definitely have that aspect there, but they control giant monsters, which is something that hasn't been seen before, both within the Godzilla franchise and in any other alien invasion story. Granted, I do have a few problems with this new type of story within the Godzilla franchise, but I'll get to those later. I also thought that the movie had really good pacing, since there's almost always something going on within the movie, regardless if it's astronauts Glen and Fuji exploring Planet X, coming in contact with the Xiliens, having the inventor Tetsuo investigating why his device isn't being sold on the market, and the parts revolved around the alien invasion aspects. Like, I was never bored while watching this movie. Granted, yes, I have said that the pacing in the other two movies is good, and it is, don't get me wrong. It's just, with those movies, I will admit, there are definitely some points in time where a scene here and there can be a tad bit slow, but works for the movie, whereas with the pacing in this movie, it's handled really well. I even like the editing flow for one particular scene. Like, if I had to describe it, it's like that one part in the first Avengers movie where you have Nick Fury talking to Maria Hill, and she's like, no, what we need are super soldiers, which leads to Nick Fury talking to Steve Rogers, then they're talking about the Tesseract, then you have Steve Rogers go, should have been left at the bottom of the ocean, which proceeds to cut to Iron Man at the bottom of the ocean. There's a sequence that's very similar to that, where we have several characters talking, then they talk about astronauts Glen and Fuji traveling to Planet X. Then we cut to astronauts Glen and Fuji traveling to Planet X in their spaceship. And the way it's shot, we don't actually physically see them, but we see their spaceship flying in space, which leads into our next scene. Because with the way the scene is set up, we have the spaceship flying, but outer space is depicted in a really inaccurate way where the stars are white, but the background is blue, which serves as a nice transition to our next scene into this restaurant where there's this one wall that has white stars and a blue background emulating outer space, which leads us into this restaurant setting. Granted, it's only for that one part of the movie, but I thought it was a really cool way to get from one scene to another. Also, this movie has perhaps the most memorable giant monster battle within the Godzilla franchise, since many Godzilla movies before and after this have a lot of giant monster battles that primarily occur on Earth. And with this movie, it features, so far, the first and only giant monster battle to occur in a new location that isn't planet Earth. And, of course, the scene ends with the great and infamous Godzilla victory dance. But enough about that. I thought that the set designs from the small miniature buildings in the city to the countryside, along with the rocky terrain of Planet X, all looked really great and very distinct from one another. Then again, I think that the special effects in this movie are really good, from the landscapes to the monster costumes. Granted, I'm still not the biggest fan of the Rodan costumes seen in this movie, but it gets the job done. And despite the movie having not that big of a budget in comparison to some of the other installments that came before it, in terms of what they were able to do with said budget, they managed to succeed in making a very memorable movie. Because when we really look at the overall story of this particular Godzilla film, it's really ambitious, since not only do you have the monster element, but you're also introducing an alien invasion story. Like, the people at Toho knew how to work with their limited budget to make a very memorable movie like this one. And speaking of budget, originally Mothra was supposed to be making an appearance in this movie, but in a way I'm glad that Mothra doesn't appear in this movie at all, for a couple reasons. The first reason being, I feel like if the movie were to include Mothra, I feel like the battles between the Earth monsters and Ghidorah would be an essential retread of what occurred in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. The second reason being, Mothra has already appeared in 2 installments before this movie, so I think that if the Mothra character were to appear in this movie, I think there would have been an oversaturation of the Mothra character seen within the Godzilla movies. I also like the fact that when you do have Godzilla and Rodan battling King Ghidorah this time around, Godzilla utilizes his atomic breath against King Ghidorah, because one of my nitpicks in the previous movie was that when the Earth monsters did fight against King Ghidorah, Godzilla never used his atomic breath on King Ghidorah for some reason. Granted, I think it had to do with budgetary cuts, but I do like the fact that this time around he finally does use his atomic breath on King Ghidorah. And there are 2 particular shots within this movie that really stood out to me. One of them occurring during Godzilla's rampage on this village in the countryside, because there are several moments in time where we get extreme close-ups of the small-scale miniatures, and then moments later we see what appears to be like this giant Godzilla foot prop crushing the house. And what makes it interesting is the foot used is not from the actual Godzilla costume, because the foot itself is a separate prop altogether, used for the sole purpose of crushing these small-scale miniatures. And there's a lot of detail that goes into both the small-scale miniatures along with Godzilla's foot. Sure, the movement of the foot can be weird in some points in time, but the fact that we have those kind of shots during a monster rampage I think is really unique. Another shot that really stood out to me is this one point in time where you have this really cool aerial shot of Tokyo Tower, or what I think is Tokyo Tower, along with its natural surroundings. And why this particular shot stood out to me the most, on top of having this really cool camera angle on this one part of the city, there's purpose behind it. Because moments before this shot even shows up, the humans discovered the Xiliens' weakness, that being high-pitched sounds, and this leads the human forces to play this high-pitched sound over radio broadcast signals, telling everybody to crank up their radios, playing this high-pitched frequency. And then that's when we get that shot, and that's when you can hear the high-pitched sound being used. And again, for a movie that didn't have as much of a budget in comparison to some of the previous installments, they knew what to do with their budget. The fact that we even had a shot like this to begin with is really impressive. I also really like the consistency between both the dub and the sub when you watch them back to back, because anytime anyone brings up this movie, other than the fact that they talk about the introduction of the alien invasion plotline that you see in later Godzilla movies, this movie is also known for including the American actor Nick Adams. Granted, within the Godzilla franchise, this isn't the first time we've seen an American actor in a Godzilla movie, but here's the difference. With something like Godzilla King of the Monsters, that was an Americanized version of the 1954 Japanese Code of the movie, where they re-edited it to include an American actor, that being Raymond Burr. With this movie, on the other hand, Nick Adams is in both cuts of the movie from the get-go. And why I bring this up, have you ever watched a Japanese movie that has both a Japanese track and an English track, but anytime you watch the Japanese track, some Americans appear in the movie randomly and they start speaking English to the Japanese people and they kind of respond back, while in the American dub, basically everybody speaks English? In this movie, there's some consistency to it, because in the Japanese code of the movie, everybody speaks Japanese. Even Nick Adams. Well, at least his character, since he was dubbed over by one of the other actors in the movie. Whereas in the American cut of the movie, everybody speaks English, and that's where we get Nick Adams' English-speaking voice. So I like how there's that form of consistency in this movie when it comes to the subbing and dubbing. Also, the English dubbing in this movie is actually pretty good, with the exception of one dubbed voice, that being the voice that the Tetsuo character has, because whereas everyone else sounds normal, Tetsuo's dubbed voice is really over the top to a point where it becomes annoying as the film progresses, because all the other dubbed voices sound like they take the script seriously, whereas I feel that the actor who did the dubbed voice for Tetsuo felt the need to sound like a cartoon, and just doesn't mesh well with the other dubbed voices. But other than the dubbed voice for the Tetsuo character, I think everyone else sounds great. Hell, even the lines in the English dub are almost a perfect translation of the lines from the Japanese version of the movie. Granted, there are definitely some points in time where they might not say the exact same thing, but they say something similar that gets the same point across. Like this one scene where you have Glenn asking a question, then you have the Xilien commander go, "You're very nosy, Mr. Glenn," or something along those lines, whereas in the English version, he goes, "You're very inquisitive, aren't you, Mr. Glenn?" Again, doesn't say the exact same wording, but it still gets the same point across. And as far as the human characters go in this movie, they're actually really memorable, because something I forgot to address in my 2 previous Godzilla movie reviews was the human element, because between Godzilla vs. Mothra and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, the characters are fine and do their jobs well, and between the 2 movies, I did think that Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster did have the more memorable cast of characters, but I think the problem was I remembered more their archetypes and relationships to each other as opposed to remembering their actual personality, quirks, and even names. With something like the human cast of characters in this movie, I remember every single one, from the 2 lead characters of Glen and Fuji, with Glenn being the wisecracking American astronaut who, on top of being a really fun character, and is a surprisingly intelligent individual. From the scenes where he puts 2 and 2 together in terms of the Xiliens' true intentions, to even outsmarting the Xiliens on certain occasions. With Fuji, on the other hand, he's essentially the no-nonsense kind of character who plays really well off Glenn. Then again, the 2 characters share really great chemistry and have this bromance essentially between the 2 of them. Although if I had to describe Fuji a bit more, on top of being the no-nonsense counterpart to Glenn, Fuji is essentially a old man stuck in a younger man's body, in that sense of you have this guy who lives in this world where it's constantly changing, and he's also very overprotective of his younger sister, to a point where he continuously acts like a dick to his sister's boyfriend, Tetsuo, and is completely single-minded in certain situations. Like, he's so dead focused on trying to find a way to exploit the Xiliens' weakness in the movie that even when Tetsuo shows up with the solution, he doesn't take Tetsuo seriously and tells him to leave, until Glenn actually steps in and tells Fuji that Tetsuo actually came up with a really creative solution to combat the alien threat. And speaking of Tetsuo in the movie is essentially this really socially awkward inventor who's not only really naive, but he's also really persistent, because throughout the course of the entire movie, he gets word that someone wants to buy his invention, and when he's like, oh, when's the money gonna come in, and when's it gonna be sold on the market, with the continuous answer coming from the Xiliens while under disguise, tell him eventually. Like, he gets so persistent that there's a point in time where he decides to follow one of the characters from the city to the Earth base to a point where he ends up getting captured. And the character in and of himself, he's essentially the underdog character of the entire movie. Because not only do you want him to succeed in making this really cool invention, but you also have him try to find a way to connect with Fuji, of all people. And as far as the rest of the cast of characters go, there are so many of them that are really memorable, from Fuji's younger sister Haruno to the double agent Miss Namikawa to the Xiliens themselves. Honestly, the human cast of characters, plus the Xiliens, are the best part of the entire movie. Hell, it's actually a lot more interesting than the giant monster aspect of the movie. And I think that's what really makes this particular installment of the Godzilla franchise really stick out. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, my first gripe with the movie is more of a nitpick, that being the Japanese title for the movie, because I think it's really misleading. Because I think the Invasion of Astro-Monster would have been a much more fitting movie title for the previous entry in the franchise. Granted, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster makes just as much sense, but for this movie, on the other hand, yeah, sure, you have the plot point of the aliens mind controlling Ghidorah to invade Earth and all that, but I really feel that Ghidorah is really not the central villain here. Instead, it's the Xiliens, and they're the main villains here. Even the American titles for this movie, that being Monster Zero or Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, in some cases make more sense, however. So I think a better title for the Japanese cut of the movie probably should have been The Assault from Planet X. I think that would have been a much more fitting title. However, like I said earlier, that's just a nitpick I have with the movie. Also, around this time period, a lot of the Godzilla movies weren't getting as big of a budget as they were back when the series first started. So you could tell that they had to cut corners in some cases. And the way they managed to cut said corners, like I said earlier, they managed to work with their limited budget very well. But even doing some rather creative things with said limited budget, problems do occur within the movie. For example, during the initial monster rampage at the very end, you see a clip from the Rodan movie. But if you watch any of my videos long enough, you would already know my views on stock footage. And speaking of stock footage, I don't know if it's me, but it feels like anytime I've seen people talk about this movie in regards to the stock footage, people treat this movie like it's the first real Godzilla film to first utilize stock footage from other movies, even though some of the previous installments have utilized stock footage in some shape or form. So I'm not entirely sure why people point to this particular movie being the one that started the whole trend. It just bugs me. And there are definitely certain parts of the movie where you can tell that the chroma key has aged a bit, but it's not the worst thing ever. And also there are several points in time where you can occasionally see the strings pulling up the flying kaiju like Rodan and Ghidorah, or see certain vehicles being pulled with string, but these aren't the worst aspects of the technicals of the movie. And I'm not sure if it's me, but there are 2 points in time where the lighting in some scenes flickers on and off. One scene being the part of the movie where you have the spaceship land on Planet X, and the other one being the scene in which you see Glen and Fuji get interrogated by the Xiliens for snooping around. I don't know, it's just, when I watched it, it feels like anytime those parts came up, the lighting in the movie started to flicker a bit. Also, you could tell that the movie had very limited budget because between Godzilla, Rodan, and King Ghidorah, the monsters themselves had very limited screen time to a point that anytime they were mentioned or showed up in the movie, I was like, oh, I forgot you were in this movie. And there's really not that much monster action till like the last 10 minutes. Hell, this is perhaps the movie in which all 3 monsters have the shortest amount of screen time, because when you really look at the amount of screen time Godzilla has from one movie to another, he has typically like 8 to 10 minutes per movie of screen time. In this movie, he has like 5 minutes of screen time in total, and it really shows. Then again, watching this movie, I almost feel that their inclusion to the story was last minute, because as I sat there watching the movie, I was like, this just reminds me of Ishiro Honda's 1959 film, Battle for Outer Space, since you do have this group of humans battling alien invaders, and that's essentially what this movie is. It just so happens to have Godzilla in it. And when Godzilla and Rodan aren't being depicted in men in suit costumes, there are several points in time where they're shown being depicted using toys and or puppets, and it just looks bad. And my last problem with the monsters in this movie has to do with the last 15 minutes of the movie, since that's the big battle that occurs within the movie, where you have the aliens mind controlling the monsters to attack Japan, while you have the humans developing the weapons to fight against the aliens, and this goes on for a good 12 to 13 minutes, and when you do have the humans finally defeat the aliens and free the monsters from their control, I feel that would have been a perfect spot to end the movie, but then the movie keeps going with this tagged-on fight with Godzilla and Rodan battling King Ghidorah, and the fight itself is really underwhelming and short to a point where, like I said earlier, you could just cut that scene out of the movie altogether, and I would have been fine with it. It just felt unnecessary to me. Another problem that I have with this movie has to do with more the influence this movie has on the franchise. Because on one hand, I do think that this movie introduced a cool concept of having aliens mind controlling the giant monsters to attack the human race for them. It's just one of those things where several movies after this, a lot of the Godzilla movies would start to utilize that whole alien invasion story a lot more often, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And my second problem with the influence this movie has on the Godzilla franchise, King Ghidorah moving forward would not be his own antagonist. Instead, he would be someone else's puppet for a remainder of the franchise, which I think brings him down quite a bit as far as being a villainous kaiju goes. And in regards to the problems I have with the movie in terms of the narrative structure or plot points, there's quite a few that come to mind. The first one being the initial conversation that Glenn and Fuji have after Glenn spends the night at Miss Namikawa's bungalow. Because the conversation they have, Glenn claims that during the night he had an encounter with the leader from Planet X. Because before this, we do see Glenn and Miss Namikawa leave to the bungalow, but we don't see what exactly transpires there. It almost feels like there was a scene that was planned but never got filmed. So this information that Glenn is telling the audience feels very jarring. Like, I actually would have been more okay if that conversation had one of two things occur. Have the quote-unquote missing scene, as I mentioned earlier, take place sometime before Glenn explains his encounter with Fuji, or maybe as he's telling the story of how the encounter went down, we cross-dissolve to the flashback and then actually see the encounter itself. But as the scene sits, it feels like there was a scene missing here that didn't give us enough of a build-up for this particular conversation to occur. As far as the other plot holes and plot points that didn't really add up to me, all have to revolve around the Xiliens themselves. Because for the longest time, I always presumed that the Xiliens were just some alien race that existed within the Godzilla universe. But as I watch this movie, they're not completely alien, because there's some points in time where you see like plugs coming out of their backs, and there are several points in time where they take orders from a computer. And the thing that really got me confused about them being aliens or robots is my copy of the DVD, because the last chapter menu says robots lose control. So I think that's why I'm so confused about whether or not the Xiliens are aliens or robots in the first place. I mean, for all I know, maybe they're like a fusion of the two, like a Borg, but again, it feels like I'm not really getting a sense of what they are. Then you have that one plot point where Glen and Fuji discover that all the female Xiliens look exactly alike, and there's never a real clear explanation as to why they all look alike. I mean, sure, you have the one scene where Glenn asks the Xilien leader as to why do all the females look alike, but the Xilien leader dodges the question, so we don't ever get a concrete answer as to why they look the same. And if you think I'm overthinking this, I probably am, but here's the thing. When you look at all the male Xiliens, sure, when they're wearing their uniforms, they all look alike, but when you see the few Xiliens on Earth trying to blend in with their human surroundings, each one has their own distinct look. Sure, for all I know, maybe that's a part of their disguise, but again, it feels like the whole female Xiliens looking alike was not explained well enough, because the movie treats this one particular scene like it's a huge significant plot twist, yet there's no follow-up to it whatsoever. And there are a few other plot points revolved around the Xiliens that aren't fully explained or just straight up confuse me. One of them being the fact that water to the Xiliens is more valuable than gold, which I think is an intriguing plot point, but much like the plot point of all the Xilien women look exactly like Ms. Namikawa, it's just one of those things where the plot point is never fully explained and seems important, but the film doesn't fully address it. That makes it relevant to the overall story. And the next plot point that's never fully explained is how the Xiliens know the location to both Godzilla and Rodan. Since you have that scene before where the Xiliens are like, hey, can we borrow both Godzilla and Rodan? With astronaut Glen and Fuji replied, we don't know where they are. And then you have the part where the Xilien commander goes, well, Godzilla's at this location while Rodan's at this location. And sure enough, both monsters are at both locations. And we're never told exactly how the aliens know the location to both monsters. The other plot point that straight up confuses me is the moment near the end of the movie where the Xiliens' spaceship and Earth base are damaged because of the human forces, and you have the leader of the Xiliens go, we must escape to the future, hits a button, then their spaceships and Earth base explode. And I don't know if the spaceships exploded because of the amount of damage that they received from the humans, or do they just naturally self-destruct? I just wish that maybe the effect was depicted differently in a way that it didn't look like the spaceships were being blown up, because the way I interpreted the whole scene was the ships were so damaged that they imploded because of the amount of damage that the humans did to their spaceships and Earth base. And the Xiliens themselves are just idiotic, because on one hand, they're terrible liars. Case in point, when Glen and Fuji first meet them, they're like, yeah, we can't inhabit the surface because of Monster Zero. We tried all our resources to get rid of him, but it failed each time. Yet they're able to use their technology to bring Godzilla and Rodan to Planet X to fight Ghidorah for them. And yeah, I know they were just setting up the humans so that they could get access to both Godzilla and Rodan, But you do see my logic behind this, right? Since they clearly have the resources to bring Godzilla and Rodan to Planet X, yet they don't use that resources to get rid of King Ghidorah. Although I am surprised that none of the human characters brought this up. Oh well, we get a really cool monster battle within the franchise. I mean, there are several other points in time where they continuously lied to the characters, from having the Xiliens on Earth disguised as businessmen telling Tetsuo that Miss Namikawa was not there, even though several minutes later, Tetsuo and his girlfriend see Glenn driving off with Miss Namikawa. But my point is made. So, for my final verdict of Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, I got mixed feelings about it. Because on one hand, as the movie sits, I think that it fits the mold of being a generic, cheesy science fiction alien invasion movie, but can be enjoyed in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 type viewing. But as a Godzilla movie, I honestly feel that the movie itself doesn't really feel like a true Godzilla movie, since Godzilla, along with the other two monsters, have very little screen time within the movie, to the point that you could take them out of the movie and rewrite some scenes to a point that you could just have a simple, generic alien invasion movie. Like, I feel like this movie has more in common with something like The Battle for Outer Space, as opposed to being a natural Godzilla movie. So, overall, I kind of view this movie in the same light as King Kong vs. Godzilla, in that same vein of, here's this one movie within the Godzilla franchise in which I understand why people like it, and I understand the importance it has on the remainder of the Godzilla franchise, but as the movie sits, I think that it's okay, but can be enjoyed in a Mystery Science Theater 3000 type viewing, as I said earlier. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla vs. Monster Zero? So it looks like the movie got generally okay to good reception. And so for my final rating of Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, I give it a 3 out of 5. So, in regards to the movie's multiple titles, which one do you prefer? Do you prefer the official titles from The Invasion of Astro-Monster, The Great Monster War, or Godzilla vs. Monster Zero? Or do you prefer the title I came up with, that being The Assault from Planet X? And see you later.